Okay. All right, so you can follow along on this in terms of what I'm going to do is I was using a simplified model to kind of work through just to make sure that I was leading you, but I'm going to create a new file. I have to save this. Let's do large objects. Let's see, we're going to be working in meters generally. Okay, so we just have a blank, and so let's just create a couple of things. So let's just go over and create a box. Let's create a couple of boxes. One there. Let's do another one. Okay, and then let's create a plane by creating a rectangle first. And then let's do surface, planar curves. Okay. Switch this to ghosted so we can see what we're seeing. Move that up a little bit. And let's do just a edit on this corner, surface point. Hold the shift key, hit that surface point. And let's just raise those a little bit. And then do the other one. Lower those just a tad. Okay. Then let's make a couple more boxes. And then I have the gumball turned on, which is down here at the bottom. And if you hold down the Alt key and drag, we can just copy those. I'll select all of them and do the same thing. Okay. And then I want to trim all of those things off. So I'll select that surface as the cutting object, hit enter. And then I'm just going to click and drag along the top there. And cuts all of those things off. Hit escape to get rid of those control points. And then let's go to select that surface. Let's go to surface tools here up at the top. And let's just offset that surface. And you type offset or click on this icon here. Yeah, that seems to be good. And let's do 0.25 meters. And let's make sure solid is yes. Okay, so now we should have a very simplified model of our building. So everybody got that? Pretty close to it? Who does not? Okay, I'll give you a minute or two to work on that. Okay, what I did was I just created a box and I extruded the box up and then I just copied it. I'll do that step again. So is everybody at this point, the two boxes in the surface? Yeah? Okay. So let's do the column step again. So all I'm doing is going to the standard tab over here and creating a box. And I'm just going to drag out in the top. It doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, this is just testing. And I'm making it taller than the surface so that I can easily select it and trim it later. Okay, everybody got that? Then I'm just going to select it. And because I have the gumball tool, I could also use the copy command, but since I have the gumball activated, I'm just going to hold down the Alt key and then click and holding that down and dragging. You can see the little plus sign that pops up. And then I'm just going to do the same thing again. Alt, click, drag. Okay. And then the next step is to select all of them because I want to copy them all. Alt, click, drag. Alt, click, drag. Alt, click, drag. And the last time. Okay, is everybody there? Oh, on the surface. So I selected the surface, and then I went over here to the side where the control points are. So you see the control points command right down here. Standard. Go to standard, and then down at the bottom there is points on. And so when you turn on the points, you can see that the points are on the corners of that surface. And all I did was pick the opposite corners and push them down a little bit, and then pick the other opposite corners and pull them up a little bit. And then you hit the escape key to get rid of those points. Okay, we ready to move on to the trim command? Okay, I'm assuming if no one says no, then we're going to move on. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is trim this. So we type trim. It asks us to select the cutting objects. That's going to be our surface. And we hit enter. And then it's asking to select the objects to trim. So instead of selecting each individually, I'm just going to click and drag across the tops. So it selects all of them, and it cuts them all off. Everybody got that? Okay. And since that surface, we want to escape to get out of that trim command, we'll reselect the surface. And now we'll go up to the top tabs and we'll select Surface Tools. And then we'll head right over to here where it says Offset Surface. Click on that. And you'll notice the arrows are pointing up, and that's exactly the way that we want it to extrude, to offset. So that is fine. And then we'll look up here, and we want to make sure we want a solid surface. So we make sure that that says yes. And then the distance I'm using, because I know I'm in meters and roughly the size, I want to be 0.25 meters. You might have drawn it at a different scale, so you might want to look at testing it. Put in 0.25 and then hit enter. And if it comes out fairly thin like this, then that's good enough. If it's super thick, then make it a smaller number. Undo it and make it a smaller number. Everybody got that? Okay, so we're going to move on to the next piece. So now we have our kind of mock-up of our building that we're going to be using. So the next thing we want to do is in Rhino, to help us on this next stage, is that we want to assign materials to these objects. So if you go over to your tabs over here and we look at the object properties, when we select something, you're going to see that we have the object, and it's going to list out names and the ability to choose the layers and everything. Right next to it is kind of a paint. Looks like a roll of paint. I don't know, roll? What is that? A tube of paint. I guess not a roll. So right now it's selecting, it's saying that we're assigning the material by layer. But what we want is everything to be assigned its material by object. So we're going to select everything. And then we're going to select, just pull that drop down menu and select object. Okay? And you'll notice that it selects a default material, which is white, and that's fine. And so what we want to do is start adding some new materials. So we want a material for the roof, a material for the columns, and then a material for each of the buildings. So we will have 4 materials in this project. So what we're going to do is right here, make sure that you have an object selected. And I'm going to do it 2 ways. So one, I'm going to do it by just the object selected, and then I'm going to show you another way using this tab here from materials, so we could put in all of the materials this way. So I want to show you 2 different ways of doing it. For now, select an object, select this tube, which is called material, the tube icon. We have the default material. Let's add a new material, and it's going to pop up Does yours come up with a list of all of the different materials? Yes, no? Who does not? Okay, so all you have to do is choose one of those materials. I'm not sure why mine is pulling up something different. There we go. So we can use white matte. So you can just choose any one of those materials, actually. It doesn't really matter at this point. All I want to do is create 4 different materials. So I can create white map. And then when you enter it, it's going to ask you to rename it. So it's a good habit to just go ahead and rename it. So I'm going to call this one roof. And what I did is I clicked on this little arrow, down arrow button, and we can see the different materials that we have available. So we have roof and default material. Another way that we can do it is by this duplicate right over here. Can you? Oh, that's cut off. Let's see if I can. Now you guys can see. So right here is this duplicate. You can just click on that, and it will duplicate the last material that you had, and we can rename it. This one we're going to rename columns. And I'm going to do it again. And then I'm going to call it box 101. I'm going to do it one more time. What's that? Okay, so if you right click on that, and then you can click down here to rename, and then we'll call this box 02. Okay. So now we have 3 different names, and right now what we need to do is assign it. So we've created all these different ones, but we want to go back and assign it our roof. So we can do that. And then let's change the color just to make sure that we've got it assigned differently. So just go down here to basic settings, click on the color, and let's just choose red for now. Okay. Now you'll notice that in the ghosted view it doesn't change, but let's go to the rendered view, and then we can now see that our material is different. Okay. So now that we have that done, let's hide this material, or hide this surface, so we'll type hide. And then we will do these boxes. Oh, I'm going to delete these columns in the middle. We don't need them. Okay, so let's assign this box now. So when we come up again, we look over here at our material properties and material, and it's at the default material. So let's select the box 01. Let's choose a different color. Let's say turquoise. Okay. Then we select the other box. We'll call that box 02. And let's select, let's say, dark green. It doesn't matter what color you're selecting. Okay. And let's hide those so we can select all our columns. So we've got all our columns selected. Again, we'll go to the Properties tab, Material, drop down, and we'll select Columns. And let's do magenta. Okay. So let's type show. And now we have basically materials applied to this object. we can delete this curve that we used to create the roof. How's everybody doing? We're up to that point? Who's not? Okay. So when you guys get done with that point, raise your hand so we can move on to the next one. If you need help, raise your hand so we can get Jay, Dylan, and Austin to come by and help out. Hey, how are we doing? Are we done? Who needs still a little more time? Okay. Yeah. Okay, how are we doing? You ready to move on to the next one? Okay. So now that we have this, we basically now have the object kind of roughly made in terms of identified in terms of materials. Now this next step, you can obviously do the same exact thing in 3D Studio Max, but I find personally it's a little bit easier to select the objects for me than the interface that 3D Studio Max uses. So this is the reason why I teach it this way, just because I think you're a little bit more familiar with the Rhino interface and how to select objects and things. It makes a little bit more sense. So let's do this. Let's file and let's save this. And we're going to call this, I'm just going to call it my tutorial. So we save that as a Rhino file. So now we have the object. We can always come back to it later. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to export this. So we want to export it into what 3D a file format that 3D Studio Max can utilize. 3D Studio Max does not, at least in previous versions. I don't know, maybe 2016. I haven't checked it yet, but it hasn't opened Rhino in the past, Rhino files, so we have to save it, we have to translate it into a different type of file. It's getting better. In the past, the file incompatibility, being able to translate files, that was one of the huge benefits of Rhino, was that it could basically read any kind of 3D geometry and translate it into another. So as a package of being able to move about geometry, it was really helpful. Now it's getting a little bit better so that there's more compatibility. But what we're going to do is select all of the objects, and then we're going to go to File and then Export Selected. That's right there. And we're going to name this thing. I'm going to call it Test Model. Let's see, this is 03 this time. Okay. And then just click down here. So if you click on this, this is the file type that it will be saved as. And as you can see, there's all kinds of different file types that you can save it as. You can save it as a 3D Studio, which can be read into 3D Studio Max. We can save it as an OBJ, which is an object file, which is another file format that works really well with 3D Max. And the other one that you can do, which when you get a little bit further, when you start to use Revit, there's a file type called .fbx, which is this motion builder. So and that's what Revit exports it out, as this FBX file format. So I want to give you don't have to worry about that right now. I just want to set the stage so that these things aren't, if it comes up, you'll know what we're talking about. So the last two objects that I tested, I used FBX on one, object on the other. And let's click on 3D Studio Max as the third object. Now you'll notice that the 3D Studio Max is just by default. Okay. Now if I click on this again and I go down to OBJ, you'll see that there's a button called Options. So pay attention to that if you're selecting these different file formats. Some of them have options, and you'll want to click on that to open that up and look and make sure that some of these things are set correctly. So if you look in, you'll probably want to, in terms of objects, you'll want to be exporting meshes. Okay. Most of these exports will export as meshes, and it'll do the translation for you automatically. Generally, if you're given an option to use Mac OS or a Windows type of formatting, then use Windows, since you're going to be operating within Windows most of the time. And then some of the other things that you'll run into on some of these file formats is this is a legacy thing that sometimes when you import your object, it'll be turned sideways because in older 3D formats, Y was actually Z in the format. So sometimes that comes in, and if you'll see that flipping X to Y or Z to Y. Not that it really matters right at the moment, I just want to kind of point that out. If something weird is happening, go into this options and you can work on that. So let's go back up to 3D Studio, Test 03, and let's go ahead and save that. You're going to bring up this polygon tool. So what this is basically we've been creating in NURB surfaces. So these are all mathematical definitions of the surface. And so what we have to do, remember when I talked about at the beginning about polygons, the difference between polygons and NURB surfaces? Polygons being actual kind of 3 points, create a surface. That's how most rendering engines want to see it, is in what they call meshes, which are these polygons. So what this does is it's a translator. So if we click preview, we can start to see how it's breaking up this surface into most of its surface. Sometimes sticking into the middle, you can see that it's pretty rough. So this is going to be one straight segment, this is going to be one straight segment, and this is going to be one straight segment. So when you see something like this, it's always going to be a balance between the more of these triangles that you see, because it's going to create a mesh of triangles. The more of them that you have, the bigger your model is going to be, and the longer kind of your render times. But if we were to leave it like this and zoom into it, the edges, the curves wouldn't show up as smooth curves. They'd be kinked and faceted. So generally what you want to do is kind of find a fine line between how much information you need to give it. And a lot of that's going to be thinking about what is the kind of rendering. So if you're going to do an interior or something that's going to be kind of a close-up, you're going to want to have more polygons. So you want this to have more triangles. A polygon is a triangle, so just keep that in mind. So let's turn this up a little bit to show, and click preview again. How is it doing that? Oh, because it is separating this thing out into its basic surface. So let me show you that in a little bit different way. I'm going to create a sphere. I'll do the same thing, export selected. Okay, so here you can see how it's going to export it. If I turn this way down, see how it removed a bunch of those? And if I turn it up, so we could start to see the facets. We can start to notice where those straight lines are going to be, because there's these big segments. So if I turn this up, now if I export it, it's going to be rendered much smoother because those line segments are in between. We can really make it super smooth if we really need to. So that's what this project does. Because our model is super simple, it's not going to give us a bunch of choices, because we actually have straight line segments between here to here and here. So really the only curve is kind of happening in here. And then the rest of our stuff is boxes. So that's why it exported that way. So has everyone got it exported? File, let's select all those. I'll just redo it again. Click OK. Alright, so now it should be exported. So then the next step, which we'll pick up on on Wednesday at the very beginning of class is how to import that into 3D Studio Max and then start to create some materials for that. So in the meantime, over for your homework in preparation is just to run through again the first basically 4 lectures here, these 4 videos, and follow along and do that. And what you'll end up with is a project that shows you how to manipulate textures and put them on a building, and then we'll go forward from there. Okay.